Physiology 223, Chapter 2, book presentation number 3. Let's get going. Within the book itself, we talked a ton about different things pertaining to research, and then we talked a little bit about how when you have research, how you can apply it within your coached environment. And sometimes you have to look at it in terms of you have the scientific component and then you apply that, and then how you actually have the art of coaching where you know how to apply that within the context of your team, and then straight through to the individual itself depending upon their needs. The book on page 23 jumps into three main psychology orientations: the psychophysiological, right? You can kind of, if you break that up and dissect that, you can think psychological, physiological as two words in which together give us psychophysiological orientation, the social psychological orientation, and the cognitive behavioral orientation. If we jump in, let's go ahead and dig in. With this psychophysiological orientation, you're studying and examining the process of the brain and their influences on physical activity. So it's what you're thinking, psychological, and how it affects the physiological component. And you're really trying to look at this and go, okay, what happens up here affects things down here, psychological, physiological. And people in this area of research, they'll typically study things like heart rate, brainwave activity, action potentials, etc., and how it affects movement. And it's important to note that when you look at these individuals, we start to compare and contrast, you start to see different things kind of creep up into the book itself. When you talk about like biofeedback techniques, etc. And it's a well-known study where they were trying to train their athletes to be able to temper, not only temper their heart rate and bring their heart rate down when they would shoot, but also they trained them to be able to be so self-aware that they knew when their heart was going to beat, and they would execute the shot in between those beats. That's a pretty heightened state, right, of awareness. But that comes from having a real good sense of the things that control the process and the process itself, right? So your muscles are responsive to a stimuli out in front of you, shooting a target with a gun in this case. And they would use things like, encephalograms, a little bit further down here, encephalograms and neuroimaging to be able to really evaluate these types of communication in the body and be able to not only have self-awareness, but also self-regulation. All right. You have social psychological orientation, and there's a presumption that behavior is determined by a complex interaction between a social environment and the personal makeup of the athlete. And this has a level of complexity to it, right? Because you have the social aspect of the athlete against the competitor, the athlete with their teammates, the athlete and the coach, and the athlete within the environment itself. Think back to the example of when there was an audience and some people performed really well and some people performed bad when performing a task. It depended upon the complexity of the task, but more accurately, the familiarity of the task. And the big thing you're focusing on here is the evaluation of the social environment. And the components I just mentioned, whether it's the competition, the coach, the environment itself, or the audience, or the fans in the stand, all have their influence here in social psychological orientation. And those are the types of things you would study in that environment. With cognitive behavioral, now this is, if you dissect this out, cognitive, thinking, behavioral, actions. You're thinking about, or you're really evaluating how people think. And, there's been numerous studies in terms of like, one of the ones that came out was all over Instagram about, 4 months ago. The study was tennis players who were in the top 20 and continually performed at the top half of the top 20 or better in the top quartile. Those individuals had a higher degree of positive self-talk, whereas the other individuals had a higher degree of negative self-talk. So in that example, they had this positive feedback loop, and their thoughts which were more positive, translated into better performance. So their thoughts and behaviors created this virtuous cycle of them being able to stay towards the top end of the top 20, whereas the other individuals who had more negative self-talk had a more deleterious cycle, and they were actually almost like self-sabotaging. But this is something that requires a good internal focus by the athlete, and it also requires a little bit of self-reporting and also a self-awareness to be able to understand one's level of confidence, their levels of anxiety, their goal orientations, and their ability to actually manifest their own imagery and motivation, which is a whole nother conversation in of itself. So if I were to break these out and compare these three, you'd have psychophysiological, social, psychological, and then cognitive behavioral orientation on here. You know, one is the study of behavior through its underlying psychophysiological process. Remember, psychophysiological is a combination of psychological and physiological. And then you have social psychophysiological, or social psychological is the behavior that's influenced by a very complex interaction between the environment, the opposition, the fans, and that person itself. And then cognitive behavioral orientation evaluate the thoughts of the athlete and determining their behavior based off of their self-talk. So with that, guys, I'm going to cut this off right here and move on. Have a great one.